All right, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the lowly op-ed and why it was the inspiration for me to start Assembly. And really, at the heart of it, it's about what really persuades people and how they vote. So we'll get right back in just a second. Welcome to Assembly Unfiltered. I'm your host, Satchel, and co-founder of Assembly, the Learn to Earn platform. Assembly Unfiltered is a podcast about democracy, privacy, blockchain, politics, leadership, company culture, crypto, security, and startups. It's meant for anyone who believes that all of us are living in challenging, turbulent, and even exciting times. We're living in a moment ripe for dramatic change. We envision this as a podcast for our tribe, people who share an interest in how all these threads weave together for better communities. This is meant for our learners, voters, advertisers, civic organizations, tech geeks, developers, and employees. I hope you enjoy this episode of Assembly Unfiltered. All right, so I want to open this up with more details found on a podcast I stumbled upon called Open Science Podcast, but mostly it's around the summary of a paper written by three folks, one of whom is at Yale as a professor, and two others are like fellows or scholars at the Cato Institute. And I thought that this was something incredibly interesting in terms of the entire scope of political persuasion. I think political persuasion is something that is increasingly top of mind, particularly during campaign season. But kind of like asking the question, what really does persuade people? What makes people change their minds? There's so much polarization right now, so many different opinions. And interestingly, it's the lowly op-ed, which is more effective according to this research. So what is an op-ed and what does it mean and why is it valuable? Well, according to this summary of this article or this paper, research paper, the New York Times was like the first modern op-ed, and op-ed stood for opposite of the editorial page, and this was September 21st, 1970. And the point of it was supposed to like really allow people like political organizations or notables, think tanks, academics to like write a paper that's, you know, really influential. And so the New York Times op-ed piece is sort of like one of those mainstays, but it's in most major daily newspapers. And so one of the questions is, you know, hey, do people actually read this? Does it have any influence? Is this something that's actually important? Or is it just people sort of like preaching to the choir? Well, here's a quote from one of the authors of the paper. They said, "We found that op-ed pieces have a lasting effect on people's views regardless of their political affiliation or their stance on an issue. People read an argument and persuaded by it. It's that simple." So, wow, to me, when we sit and digest the impact of that, it really is running counter to the way most persuasion is done. We saw that the Biden administration got in front of a bunch of TikTok influencers and, you know, asked them to try to shape people's opinion by getting on their TikToks and providing videos. And I don't know how successful that really is. But here, what's interesting is like it's op-eds. And they said that people exposed to op-eds, they actually shifted their views to support the argument presented in the piece. And it didn't have much variance between whether the person was an elite and whether someone was in the general public. And it seemed to have some lasting effect because, you know, little change between 10 and 30 days. And so I thought this is very intriguing, and it's very different from the way our current political discourse is done. So if you remember that I had an earlier post/podcast about Hegel and dialectic and how hearing both sides is a really good way to form an opinion, a synthesis of ideas to reach the best conclusion. And I consider the op-ed as like one piece of that. I would say the best way is for people on both sides to read a really good, riveting op-ed on both sides and then come to their conclusion. And in many ways, they talked about the nature of these arguments. An op-ed is basically a very succinct, fits on the column of a paper. That's an argument. And so we call our ads, or a big part of our ads, arguments based on that. We want people to be understand that it's an argument that they are reading, and we want advertisers to come in the framing of they're presenting an argument. And this becomes very clear. The benefit for the person reading the op-ed is it's an opinion piece. It's, somebody is trying to persuade you of a very specific point of view. And you can agree with it, disagree with it, you can wrestle with it. And so entering this argument is actually a critical part of how to engage with our platform. So an argument is a very key concept, and it's actually how the ads are called. They really are arguments. The component is an argument. And what's interesting is that the art of a well-done argument may actually, not be that familiar. I think a lot of this discourse is sort of yelling and emotions and branding, and I'm not really sure that clearly the research shows otherwise, is that somehow this approach. Now, what's the downside? If somebody said, yeah, I'm going to spend some time reading the New York Times op-ed, it would just be received with a snore. Like, it's just not appealing. Nobody really wants to go to a New York Times op-ed piece, really, and just kind of like casually spend time, reading it while they're standing in line or, as something entertaining. And so I think that is kind of like the form factor that we want to wrestle with. We want the impact to be just like that of an op-ed piece, meaning it's a well-framed, very cogent, extremely concise op-ed. And you're rewarded for actually doing it, digesting it, reviewing and answering, their questions, which are designed to ensure that you understand the salient points. But I think, in talking with a colleague about the nature of ads is we got to make them fun. And so we really tried to focus on making it very short, very small. I'm really thinking about other ways to make that ad format more engaging. Right now, the elements are gamified in terms of that you get points by how correct you are. But there are probably other things that we can explore. But the core backbone is always an argument. It is basically what's going to help people understand an issue. The onus now is on those crafting the arguments. I've seen written examples of arguments, and they're just thick blocks of text, and that's like instantly a turn on. You see that and you're like, meh. I think the challenge will be for marketers to come up with arguments that are clear, they're easy to understand, easy to digest, and honestly fun. And so that's kind of like the framing that we're trying to do. But this research paper, and actually there's a lot more detail that's found in this in this podcast called Opinion Science Podcast. A lot of it, might go over your head because they really go into depth about how they try to validate whether there was actually a moving of the needle in terms of opinion, which I think is absolutely fascinating. I think the podcast, in Opinion Science Podcast, sort of raised the question where a lot of these consultants sort of like say, well, we've got this message and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And they found that those weren't necessarily as effective standalone. Now, maybe there's some synergy that goes together. They have to go together in terms of the awareness to get somebody to bother to actually go through the op-ed. That's a whole separate thing. I think if you can collapse it and make it more contained, and it's both interesting and they're incentivized to digest it, and the core experience is still reading and understanding an argument, ideally on both sides of the issue, I think that that is just a much better experience. And reading it, even if it's short, but it's a cogent argument that's trying to drive some understanding around a topic, is certainly also going to be better experience for the voter. Right now, I think there's a lot of brain damage that goes on when people are trying to understand. It's either like it's confusing, it's overwhelming, or it's a lot of just sort of name calling and trolling. And that's not going to be a good experience for somebody to actually bother to understand something. So in this one, I really think arguments persuade voters. The research is there, but click through our show notes to find a link to the podcast as well as to the summary paper, which I thought was fascinating. I don't know how to get access to the actual paper, so I would love to read it if I could, and hopefully I could understand it if I could. But between those two, I think it is absolutely worthwhile if you care or are interested in how do you persuade people on political issues. So this is a quick one, and hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you next time. As always, go to the show notes. You can record a question for me, and I will answer them right on this podcast. And until next time, see ya.